Welcome to Parakletis YouTube channel, and in these next few videos I'm going to give you some training and teaching about trauma or PTSD. I'm going to begin with what we call level 1 trauma healing training that we give to our healers that minister through Parakletis. And I'm going to start with our first one, understanding and healing trauma, with what is trauma. The clinical definition of PTSD is an emotional and mental problem that may occur when a person witnesses or experiences a life-threatening event, such as civil conflict, natural disaster, sexual trauma, for example, rape or molestation, and war. Trauma may be experienced when an individual witnesses or experiences an unusual and extraordinary life-threatening event in which they think or feel their life or the life of someone else is being threatened. Now let me break that definition down a little bit for you and then make a comment about how the understanding of PTSD has broadened over the years since it was first developed. When it was first developed, this idea of PTSD was restricted to combat experiences. And that goes back many, many years and even centuries. There's records of those experiencing what we call PTSD coming out of ancient Rome, for example, and of course right up through First World War, where it's called shell shock, and then the Second World War, where it's called combat fatigue, and then finally being labeled as PTSD out of the Vietnam War. Those letters PTSD stand for post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. But what happened over the years was this concept of PTSD began to expand or broaden from simply combat experience to include anything that was an extraordinary and unusual event in which the person felt their life was threatened. So let me comment on that for just a moment. There's a difference between trauma and crisis. A crisis is something that most of us experience all the time. If I don't have the money for my rent or mortgage, I'm going to have a crisis. It's not trauma, because not having enough money to pay bills is not an extraordinary or an unusual event in which I feel my life is threatened. It happens to everyone, and it can happen to some of us more often than not. A trauma is, first of all, by definition, an extraordinary and unusual event. It's out of the ordinary. It's different from what someone might experience. So that's the first thing you need to think of. Like, for example, an earthquake. That is an extraordinary and unusual event. A tsunami. That's an extraordinary and unusual event. And certainly combat in war is an extraordinary and unusual event. The second aspect of that is the person has to think or feel their life has been threatened because of that extraordinary and unusual event, or the life of someone else. So in a combat situation, an individual might be traumatized because a buddy's life is threatened, but not theirs, but it could still be traumatic for them. And so when you look at this idea of trauma, as we'll look at further in the signs and symptoms, it is significant in how it affects anyone that is traumatized. The first time I taught this that you're hearing now, and I'm giving you an abbreviated form of what we do more extensively when we train our healers, was after the tsunami that occurred back in the early 2000s. Some of you may remember that on the day after Christmas, there was a huge tsunami that hit throughout Southeast Asia. One of the places it struck, which was actually the most devastating, was in the northern province, Aceh province of Indonesia, and in particular a place called Banda Aceh. And in less than 3 minutes, 188,000 people were killed when that point of Banda Aceh, at the very tip, was struck by 3 waves traveling at 500 miles an hour over 100 feet tall. Now, that was a traumatic event. Now, when we talk about, and it was extraordinary and unusual, so you get what the definition is trying to cover here. And we'll go through a diagnostic tool to help you understand exactly the criteria that need to be met in order to fulfill that diagnosis. So we want people to understand how devastating trauma can be. And it will affect different people different ways. We know today that if someone is in a natural disaster, about half of them will be traumatized. If you're in a car accident, again, about half will be traumatized because a car accident can be a traumatic event. Someone who has been raped, about 75% will be traumatized. Someone who has experienced a combat situation, 95% will be traumatized. It's the highest rate of being traumatized of any traumatic event, because that's when a person really experienced an unusual or extraordinary event which their life truly is being threatened. Now, the letters PTSD stand for, first of all, post. Secondly, traumatic. What we're saying here is after the traumatic event. The third letter is stress. That traumatic event has become so stressful to the person, and the final is disorder. It creates disorder in their life. What I'm trying to say is this: there's a difference between the traumatic event and being traumatized, because as just mentioned, not every person who experiences a traumatic event is traumatized. But if they're traumatized sometime after that traumatic event, the stress that has accompanied that traumatic event will be so overwhelming that it will create massive disorder in that person's life. And from our perspective, in Parakletis, needs to be healed. And we talk about healing trauma in Parakletis. When I was trained in combat trauma treatment by the Veterans Administration and the Department of Defense, we are told directly, do not use the word healing, because you cannot be healed of PTSD. It's like if you go to your doctor and you have cancer, he's going to give you treatment for the cancer. He's not going to say he's going to heal your cancer. He may say that he treats and God heals, but he doesn't do the healing. There's a treatment process you have to go through. When we talk about trauma, PTSD, from a Christian perspective, like Parakletis does, we believe that God heals. And so I don't work for the Veterans Administration anymore. I work for Jesus, so I have no problem saying I believe that Jesus can heal these deep wounds of trauma. There are 4 main signs to trauma or PTSD. They are these 4. 1, reliving or re-experiencing the traumatic event. Now let me pause here. These signs are important to know, because that's what you're looking for to diagnose if the person has PTSD. The first being that person keeps reliving and re-experiencing the traumatic event. They can't get it out of their mind, no matter how hard they try. If they're Christians, for example, they may get prayer many, many times, but they can't escape the thoughts of that traumatic event. They are obsessed with it. And no matter what they do, they can't stop thinking about it, even though they don't want to think about it. The second sign is avoiding any people, any places, or things that reminds the person of the traumatic event. So if they've been in a car accident, they may have a hard time getting in a car because it reminds them of the traumatic event. A woman that's been raped, if their rapist had a certain cologne and they smell that cologne again, it reminds them of that traumatic event. She may push away even her husband because the way he touches her reminds her of that traumatic event. And so the second sign we look for, is there any person, place, or thing, it's called avoidance, that this individual does avoid because it reminds them of the traumatic event. Thirdly is negative thinking, feelings, and beliefs. Someone who has been traumatized sees the world through a negative lens. Everything is negative. Everything is bad. They're never going to succeed at life. They're never going to be anything. Nothing is ever going to be better. I work with lots of individuals that have been wounded by the trauma of war, like in South Sudan, and when you talk to them, they will tell you there will always be a war in South Sudan. There will always be a war in Congo. Nothing is ever going to change. They have a negative view of the world. Even when you try to help them to be positive, they will interpret your attempt to be positive as negative, even though that's not your intention. Fourth is hyperarousal or hyper-anxiety. They're very anxious and worried about everything. And that sign is provoked often by acts of impulsive anger as a way to express the anxiety that they have. And so when we look at what trauma is, remember, is that extraordinary and unusual event in which the person feels or thinks their life is being threatened, characterized by 4 specific signs: reliving and re-experiencing the traumatic event even though they don't want to. Secondly, avoiding any people, places, or things that remind them of the traumatic event. Thirdly, a negative view of the world. And finally, excessive anxiety or hyperarousal. Let me give you now the basic primary symptoms of trauma. Now let me pause and try to make a distinction. There are 4 signs to being traumatized. There are multiple symptoms of trauma that grow out of the signs. So signs and symptoms are different. The symptoms are obsessive and intrusive thoughts. The person, again, can't get out of their minds what's happened to them. There's this avoidance we talked about. Another symptom that's very common to a person who's traumatized is anger. They seem to be angry all the time. Primarily over what most of us would think of, something that is small or little that causes them to express the anger they have. And often they do it in very aggressive and even at times violent ways. Being completely negative, sleep disorders. The number one symptom of trauma is sleep disorder. And there's 3 possible kinds of sleep disorders. Insomnia, in which the person cannot get to sleep. Secondly, sleep disruption, where the person gets up somewhere during the night and cannot go back to sleep. Or early rising, when the person gets up an hour or more earlier than what they intended. Now in level 2, and even in my brief sort of comments about level 2 training we go more extensively into sleep disorders, because it really is the number one sign, actually the number one symptom of being traumatized. When I used to work with the military, often these gentlemen coming back from combat didn't want to discuss that they thought they might be traumatized because it could affect their career. So I would never approach it directly to them. Have you been traumatized? The way that they would open up about it, because if I asked that, they would say no. But what I did ask them is, do you have a problem sleeping? And invariably they would say, oh, I can't get to sleep. Or I get up every night and I can't go back to sleep. And that told me this person probably has been traumatized. Next to look at the signs is deep depression or profound sadness. So it's not the kind of depression that often people have, or feel sad or blue, but it's such a deep depression that it creates an incapacity in their life. Feeling helpless and hopeless is another very common symptom of being traumatized. I can't do anything to change my life. My life is never going to change. This overwhelming sense of powerlessness. Apathy and lethargy. I don't care. I don't have any energy. They seem exhausted all the time. Relationship problems, very common as a symptom of trauma. Relationships in the marital relationship, relationship with family, relationship with work, relationships with friends, relationships in church. They just can't seem to get along with people and often push them away. Hypervigilant simply means they're always looking around for something to happen that would be life-threatening. Nightmares is a very common symptom from those who are traumatized, and not wanting to talk about the traumatic event. So in closing, in this first video about how to know if you or someone is traumatized, I want you to remember those important aspects of trauma being an unusual and extraordinary event in which the person thinks or feels their life is traumatized, those 4 basic signs, and the multiple symptoms of growing out of those signs. The next video we're going to talk about what to do to bring healing to yourself or someone who is traumatized. Thanks for listening.